The lights were dimmed just enough to give the stage a cinematic glow, a detail Jimmy Kimmel insisted on when hosting veteran legends like Clint Eastwood. The audience had filed in with the usual anticipation, expecting a nostalgic conversation about Clint's decades-long film career, tales from the sets of westerns, and perhaps a humorous jab or two about the state of modern Hollywood. But what unfolded that night would shatter expectations, stain reputations, and become one of the most talked-about talk show moments of the decade. Clint walked onto the stage with that same rugged swagger that made him an icon. His sharp jaw, furrowed brows, and no-nonsense demeanor silenced the applause quicker than most guests. Jimmy, playing the role of the affable late-night host, greeted him warmly and eased into pleasantries. They exchanged brief quips about aging, movie trends, and the chaos of Hollywood politics. Everything seemed in order, and for a few fleeting moments, it was. But that illusion crumbled the moment Jimmy shifted the tone. With a forced grin, he introduced a segment titled Legends versus Progress, a pre-planned discussion meant to draw out Clint's views on today's cultural and social movements. Clint had been briefed on the topic backstage but didn't expect the ambush-style phrasing Kimmel used to launch the conversation. Jimmy, leaning forward, questioned whether Eastwood's old-school values had become outdated. He smirked as he asked if Clint's views were part of the problem in an evolving industry. It wasn't curiosity driving the conversation. It was provocation disguised as intellectual inquiry. Clint's eyes narrowed, not with confusion, but with rising irritation. Rather than deflect, Clint leaned into the tension. He criticized moderns, Hollywood's obsession with rewriting history and painting over discomfort with forced inclusivity and pandering. His voice was calm, but laced with contempt for what he called the theatrical guilt trip Hollywood had become. The audience shifted in their seats. Some chuckled nervously, others sat frozen, unsure whether to support the icon or recoil from the storm they felt brewing. Jimmy responded with sarcasm, asking if Clint missed the days when actors could say anything they wanted without accountability. It was phrased like a joke, but the bite was clear. The camera zoomed in on Clint's face, which remained stone still. He waited just long enough for the silence to sting before firing back, with a cold, biting assessment of the hypocrisy he saw in Kimmel's own career. He referenced past skits, off-color jokes, and moments the host had swept under the rug with PR apologies. The audience's laughter died immediately. This was no longer entertainment. It was personal. Jimmy's smile faded, his defenses cracking, as he stammered into a rebuttal. But it was too late. Clint had touched a nerve, and the mood had turned. What had started as a playful sparring match had now become a standoff, one with decades of pent-up resentment on one side and performative progressivism on the other. Behind the scenes, producers exchanged frantic glances. This was not in the script. Ratings might skyrocket, but the brand risk was undeniable. The segment was only 10 minutes in, but the tension was so thick that the control room briefly considered cutting to commercial early. They didn't. They wanted to see what would happen next. Everyone did. As the segment neared its midpoint, Clint leaned back in his chair, arms folded, completely unfazed by the backlash stirring online in real time. He had been criticized before, called names before, and shut out before. But this, in his mind, was a battle worth engaging in. Jimmy, on the other hand, was struggling. The audience's energy wasn't with him the way it normally was. He tried to lighten the mood with a joke about Clint being stuck in the past, but it only fanned the flames. Clint raised his voice slightly, his words cutting through the laughter like a bullet through glass. The soundstage fell into a stunned silence again. The debate was only beginning, and both men were preparing for war. Jimmy tried to recover by smiling wider, but it was clear his confidence had slipped. The audience could sense the shift. This was no longer a light-hearted interview wrapped in nostalgic reverence. It was a battleground of ideology. Clint Eastwood, didn't flinch. In fact, he seemed more comfortable now, staring across the desk with a gaze that didn't blink. He knew Jimmy was scrambling, and he was going to make him work for every second of the remaining segment. When Jimmy attempted to steer the conversation toward reconciliation, suggesting that Hollywood's changes were a necessary part of cultural growth, Clint interrupted. His tone sharpened. He called out the hypocrisy of modern media, pointing out how quickly entertainers turn into moral lecturers while hiding their own past indiscretions behind fake apologies and well-timed charity. Jimmy winced. He knew where this was going, and Clint didn't hold back. The actor called attention to an old clip, one buried deep in Kimmel's career, that had resurfaced once before and caused a stir. It had been laughed off at the time, a moment passed off as satire. But Clint laid it bare now, stripping it of its context and humor, and presenting it as evidence of moral inconsistency. The audience gasped. This wasn't just a disagreement anymore. It was a targeted takedown. Kimmel fired back, accusing Clint of living in a bubble of privilege, shielded from the consequences of his words by his legendary status. He suggested that Eastwood's entire career was propped up by outdated values, and that modern audiences had simply outgrown his brand of stoicism. But Clint met the accusation head-on. With grim focus, he declared that what Jimmy called progress was often just cowardice wearing a mask of virtue. That real strength didn't lie in appeasing every demand for conformity, but in standing firm, even when you were alone. The audience didn't know how to react. Applause felt inappropriate. Laughter had vanished. Phones were being pulled out, not to record jokes, but to document a live conflict unraveling on national television. It wasn't just about Hollywood anymore. It was about principles, power, and pride. Behind the scenes, a commotion erupted. Network executives huddled around monitors, debating whether to intervene. Clint had been booked as a surprise closer to the week's guest lineup, meant to end the show on a high note. Now, he was risking turning the entire night into a disaster. But no one moved. Everyone was too afraid or too fascinated to pull the plug. Jimmy leaned in again, but this time his tone was darker, more confrontational. He asked Clint if he truly believed he had never said or done something that would be considered offensive today. He wanted him to admit fault, to acknowledge that his world had changed and maybe left him behind. Clint responded with brutal honesty. Yes, he had made mistakes. Yes, the world had changed. But what he wouldn't do was apologize for every decision that made him who he was. He wouldn't grovel for forgiveness from people who had no interest in understanding him. That landed hard. Clint's voice was gravelly but unwavering. He spoke not like a guest trying to win over a crowd, but like a man who had already accepted that he was outnumbered and didn't care. Jimmy's eyes narrowed. His usual playbook of humor and sarcasm had failed. Now his frustration boiled to the surface. He accused Clint of weaponizing his legacy, of using his fame to push a toxic narrative of resistance to change. Clint stood up. The audience froze. There was no yelling, no table slamming, no dramatic outburst. He simply rose from his chair, his presence towering and deliberate. He didn't walk off, not yet. He just stood, facing Jimmy head-on. The message was clear. He wasn't just there to entertain. He was there to make a point, even if it cost him everything. Jimmy, caught between maintaining control of his show and defending his position, made the mistake of trying to mock Clint's exit. But before he could finish the sentence, Clint cut him off. Not with words, but with the kind of silence that dominates a room. The air thickened. The show had become something else entirely. A moment in time where two eras collided, and neither would walk away unchanged. The silence that followed Clint's decision to rise was unlike anything the studio had ever experienced. The usual buzz of camera movement, stage crew whispers, and audience fidgeting had all stopped. Even Jimmy, who prided himself on improvisation, seemed paralyzed by the weight of the moment. He had pushed too far, and for the first time, The late-night host found himself cornered not by a controversy, but by a presence that refused to play along. Clint didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. With his tall frame cast in shadow, beneath the overhead lights, he delivered a scathing critique, not just of Jimmy, but of what the show represented. He called out the polished hypocrisy, the empty virtue signaling, and the smug superiority that permeated every corner of Hollywood's elite circles. It wasn't a rant, it was a reckoning. The audience stared, wide-eyed, not daring to applaud, unsure if this was still part of the show or if it had veered into something far more real. Jimmy tried to regain his footing. He fumbled through his cue cards, looking for a way out, a transition, anything, but nothing worked. The teleprompter no longer mattered. The jokes were useless. What he had on his stage wasn't a guest. It was a symbol of defiance, and it refused to be silenced. Then came the fatal mistake. In a desperate attempt to reclaim control, Jimmy took a direct jab at Clint's family. He referenced a recent headline about Eastwood's son, twisting it into a punchline aimed at undermining Clint's moral high ground. The crowd groaned. It wasn't funny. It was cruel. And it was the exact moment everything fell apart. Clint's expression changed. His eyes, once steady, darkened. He stepped forward, not to strike, but to deliver his final blow, a brutal, clear-eyed statement about the difference between entertainers who build something lasting and those who tear others down for applause. It wasn't about politics. It wasn't about culture wars. It was about dignity. Producers behind the scenes had seen enough. They began signaling to stage managers to prepare for an emergency cut. The director motioned to start the break, but Jimmy waved them off. He still believed he could recover, that he could turn the chaos into a teachable moment, or maybe a clip that would trend for days. But the audience wasn't with him anymore. The energy had shifted entirely. Viewers at home were glued to their screens, not for laughs, but to witness what felt like the collapse of a carefully maintained persona. Security lingered just off stage, not because Clint was dangerous, but because the tension was. A misstep, a wrong word, even a misunderstood movement, and the scene could erupt into something far more damaging. But Clint didn't lash out. He stood firm, holding the moment in place like a man who had seen worse and survived. His presence alone was a challenge. Jimmy, sensing that he was losing not just the argument but the audience, turned to the cameras and tried to wrap up the segment with a forced smile. He suggested they agree to disagree, hoping to appear gracious. But it rang hollow. The words hung in the air, limp and unconvincing. Clint didn't even respond. He simply turned to walk away, leaving the chair empty and the studio frozen. But before he could make it off stage, something remarkable happened. A few members of the audience stood. Then a few more. It wasn't applause they offered. It was silent respect. A nod to the man who didn't flinch under pressure, who didn't crumble under confrontation. Jimmy looked out at them, confused, frustrated, realizing he had not only lost control of the show, but the narrative itself. Clint reached the edge of the stage and paused. Without turning around, he gave a final comment that didn't attack or provoke. It was something closer to a challenge, one that asked the audience and Jimmy alike to question who truly stood for something and who merely stood for show. Then he exited. No security escort, no cue, no fanfare. Just the heavy silence of a studio struggling to understand what had just unfolded. The moment Clint stepped off the stage, a wave of confusion swept through the studio. Audience members remained seated, as if unsure whether the show was continuing or if it had been quietly canceled mid-broadcast. The band, usually quick to play an outro riff during tense moments, stayed silent. Jimmy Kimmel sat behind his desk, gripping the arms of his chair, his eyes flicking toward the crew behind the cameras for direction. But none came. The tension hadn't disappeared with Clint's exit. It had only deepened. People were whispering. In the crowd, Not about Eastwood's words, but about Jimmy's. There was a sense that the room had turned against him, not because they all agreed with Clint, but because they had seen something that wasn't supposed to happen. The polished mask of late-night civility had cracked, and behind it was a host unprepared for real confrontation. Backstage, Clint moved through the corridor with deliberate calm. He wasn't gloating. He wasn't angry. He simply carried the weight of the moment, aware that what had happened would ripple far beyond that studio. A producer tried to approach him, stammering apologies and assurances, but Clint simply nodded once, said nothing, and kept walking. No press quotes, no handlers, just quiet resolve. Inside the studio, Jimmy finally found his voice again. He leaned forward, attempting to deliver an impromptu monologue that cast the entire exchange as a passionate disagreement between generations. He used words like conversation, growth, and progress, hoping to regain the moral high ground. But the speech felt rehearsed, even though it wasn't. He had slipped into damage control mode, and the audience could feel it. The camera stayed on him longer than usual, and that decision backfired. Every blink, every twitch, every pause felt magnified under the pressure of scrutiny. He was no longer the witty, in-control host viewers had come to expect. He was now a man caught in the fallout of a confrontation he had invited but could not contain. Back at home, social media was already ablaze. Clips from the taping were being uploaded from audience members' phones. Viewers dissected every facial expression, every word, every micro-reaction. Some praised Clint for standing firm in his beliefs. Others slammed him for his bluntness. But the overwhelming narrative was not about who was right or wrong. It was about how quickly a seemingly safe environment could become a powder keg when the script was challenged. The network released a brief statement within the hour, calling the exchange an unexpected and passionate discussion, and reminding viewers that late-night television remains a space for all voices. But that did little to stop the storm. Media outlets picked it up. Headlines ran wild. Eastwood erupts on Kimmel. Talk show turns tense. Old Hollywood versus new morality. Everyone had a version of what happened. None of them felt like the full truth. And yet, in the midst of the media chaos, Clint didn't speak. He went home. He sat with the moment. He didn't need to clarify or spin the story. The footage spoke for itself. He knew the consequences would come. Roles might vanish. Invitations might stop. But none of it mattered as much as what he had walked away with. His sense of self intact. Jimmy, however, was rattled. That night, long after the cameras were off and the audience had cleared, he stayed in the studio. He replayed the tape. Over and over, searching for the moment where it all slipped. The moment where the room stopped laughing with him and started watching him, not as a host, but as a man unsure of what he believed. In the coming days, there would be interviews, statements, and endless commentary. But the one thing no one could deny was that the confrontation had peeled back something real. The show had become more than entertainment. It had exposed the thin line between performance and authenticity, and Clint Eastwood had walked across that line with both boots planted firmly on the ground. 3 days later, Clint Eastwood appeared at a press conference, not for damage control, not to apologize, but to support a small independent film he had produced quietly over the past year. The timing was no accident. Reporters swarmed the event expecting commentary on the explosive Kimmel interview. Clint didn't shy away from it, but he didn't dwell either. When asked if he regretted anything, his response was brief, direct, and final. He said the moment was exactly what it needed to be. That calm refusal to bend became the story. While Jimmy Kimmel continued his nightly show, trying to ease back into his familiar rhythm of jokes and celebrity gossip, the memory of what had happened refused to fade. Public opinion remained split, but something had undeniably shifted. The viral clip was still circulating, But now it was being used in lectures, debates, and even high school media studies classes, not as an example of cancel culture or free speech, but of confrontation, raw, real, and unscripted. Clint didn't change course. He refused interviews from major outlets, turned down requests for joint appearances, and ignored calls from executives, asking him to clarify his views in a more media-friendly format. What he did instead was return to work. He visited veterans' hospitals, oversaw post-production edits for his new film, and kept doing what he had always done, moving forward with purpose, never waiting for public approval. Meanwhile, Kimmel's team met behind closed doors to strategize. Viewership hadn't plummeted, but something else was happening. His audience no longer looked at him the same way. A portion had turned cold, not because of politics, but because of performance. They saw through the charm now, remembering the moment he lost composure, not because he was outgunned, but because he underestimated a man who refused to play along. The network debated bringing Clint back, not to apologize, but to stage a reconciliation, something heartfelt, something that could be spun as healing. But Clint declined. He didn't want resolution. He had already made peace with the fact that some people would never understand his perspective. What mattered to him was not approval, but honesty. Eventually, Jimmy addressed the incident again, this time with carefully crafted sincerity. He spoke about respect, growth, and how difficult conversations were essential, but for all the right words. The audience sensed it was too rehearsed, too cautious. He had lost something that night, and all the clever monologues in the world couldn't bring it back. And yet, out of the ashes of the confrontation, something important emerged. Viewers began to demand more from the platform. They questioned the line between satire and substance. They asked for guests who would challenge, not flatter. Other shows followed suit, inviting on thinkers, creators, and yes, even critics who could speak without filter. Clint Eastwood, whether he intended to or not, had cracked open the mold of late-night television. He had reminded people what it looked like when a guest wasn't there to sell a film or charm the host, but to stand his ground, consequences, be damned. Weeks passed. The frenzy died down. New scandals arrived. New celebrities took the headlines. But the night Clint was kicked off Jimmy Kimmel's show remained, etched into the memory of those who watched it happen live. It was no longer just a moment of tension. It had become a symbol of resistance in a world built on scripted applause. And in a quiet California town, Clint sat on his porch, sipping coffee, watching the horizon with the same unwavering gaze. He gave Jimmy Kimmel. He didn't gloat. He didn't regret. He just endured. Because when the cameras shut off and the lights go down, the ones who stand tallest are those who never asked for the spotlight to begin with.